Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the Los Osos Groundwater Basin Management Committee meeting. We'll call the meeting to order, and we'll start off with the roll call.
All right, Director Sesena.
I'm here.
Director Gibson.
Here.
Director Reinecke.
Here.
Chair Zimmer.
Here.
Great. Note 3, board directors present in person, and Director Gibson is remote.
All right, thank you. All right, pledge allegiance.
United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with justice for all. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move to item 4, board member comments. None in the boardroom. Supervisor Gibson?
Yeah, let me just introduce an item, and I know our various agency staff will follow up on it, and that has to do with the Title 19 retrofit to build provisions. Now that we are wrapping up the details that are going to allow a few new homes to be built in Los Osos, we're getting down to the practicalities of how we and the applicants are going to be implementing those Title 19 requirements. And we're getting a little bit of feedback about ways in which on two things. One of them is ways in which we can help applicants find sites that will accept a retrofit, knowing that, of course, that the program is voluntary to those who have the potential to be retrofit. Folks have been out knocking on doors and, are getting a little frustrated or perhaps daunted at the amount of work that it takes to track down enough retrofits to get the necessary credit. So in talking to our planning staff, we're hoping we might get some assistance from the water purveyors in terms of communicating with your customers, finding out who has retrofits and would be interested, who would not in any case be interested. There are folks who don't want to be bothered with any of this, even though they might have some opportunities within their house. We don't want to bother them, and we don't want to waste applicants' time knocking on doors that are going to be dead ends. And then hopefully somewhere in the middle are folks who are interested but need further information or some way of working there. So I've had some preliminary conversations with with the LOCSD and with Golden State. I didn't make it to S&T, but our planning staff would like to reach out and work on ways in which we can work together. There are a range of things. The second part of what we're finding in Title 19 is we are going to be testing the estimates that Madaus made when they put together that report. They indicated that there might be opportunity to retrofit, as I think it was a couple hundred, enough retrofits to serve perhaps a couple hundred new homes. That was based on certain rates of acceptance, and we're going to be testing whether that is actually going to obtain. My gut feeling is we may be saturating the retrofit market a little sooner than we expected, and I'd like to be ready for that. So there are a variety of things that I think we'd like to discuss, planning staff, the water purveyor, things like how we can do water. It's basically under the heading of water conservation, right? So are there opportunities in outside irrigation? Are there opportunities with relatively large users that can be taken as a bunch? And are there bigger opportunities for new development to pay their share of developing the new water that's required for the new development? So all those things have their timelines, have their levels of complexity, but I wanted to bring that to awareness in the public setting to know that that's something the county is very interested in pursuing conversation on. And that happy to answer any questions, but there are probably at this point more unanswered questions than answered questions, and we'll let staff start working on this. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Supervisor Gibson. Any questions or comments regarding that?
I just have one clarifying question. So I've heard recently, and it is, I think, set in stone that the retrofits have to be within each purveyor area. Is that correct?
That is part of the ordinance. That was based on our discussion with you all. The purveyors very much wanted that to be the case. And that further constrains the opportunities, but we'll see how we might work through that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, well, thank you. Yeah, we agree, of course, happy to assist in any way we can. We also, encourage the alternatives that you mentioned, just exploring options for additional conservation that may be a modification to the retrofits that could help meet the program's goals and objectives. So we'll be happy to work with staff on that.
Great. Thanks so much.
Sure. Yeah, okay, so we'll move to public comment on item 4, the board member comments.
If you have public comment and you're in the boardroom, please come up to the podium. And if you're online, please raise your hand. We will take public comment in the boardroom first.
Hello, my name is Robert Sarby. I live on 4th Street here in Los Osos. I have a concern here. I don't know where our firefighting water comes from. Does it come from our basin? Or do we have a separate water allocation for that? Should we have an incident like Los Angeles, we could drain our entire basin fighting that fire if that's the case. Does the board have some sort of contingency plan for that? Do they set aside a certain amount of water in the aquifer for that? And I'd like to know the answer to that. Thank you.
Sure.
There are no further public comment in the boardroom or online.
All right, we'll bring it back to the board. Okay, so thank you for the comment, and we'll take that into account. Move on to item 5, special presentations. There are none today, so we'll continue moving on to item 6, the consent agenda. We have 2 items on consent. The 2024 financial report and approval of December 3rd, 2024 special BMC meeting.
Thank you, Chair Zimmer. Yeah, consent agenda. I'd like to call this the closeout financial report for 2024, but we still do have a couple of outstanding, well, really one outstanding project that I would consider as part of the 2024 budget, and that is the LA 14 and 16 monitoring wells. But I think a couple of things to note in that if you look at the current spending status of the budget on page 2 of the consent agenda or page 5 of the agenda packet, we're currently showing a remaining budget of $129,000. And so I believe we have all of the consultant invoices included in this budget. Oh, geez. Actually, I think we're missing a couple of consultant invoices in this packet. I don't, that's my bad, sorry. Now I have the updated version. So a couple of things to note. So all of the consultant invoice, the hydrogeo, the executive director, the other support invoices, I believe, are in for the year. So the only remaining outstanding costs that we have for 2025 would be the LA 14-16 well modifications. So that's a $70,000 remaining budget item. We are currently under budget for that item. We have $145,000 total budgeted for that. BMC would be contributing 70. The National Estuary Program would be contributing 75. So even if we spend the full 70, we are projected to have approximately $46,000 of unspent budget at the end of calendar year 2024. And I just wanted to highlight that because that will come up later in our budget reserve action item. What do we want to do with that money? And yeah, the other thing to note, there are 2 invoices flagged under the warrant list for executive director services for BMC consideration for approval. These are services for November and December that exceeded the budget amount that we had for executive director services, and thus require BMC approval to approve those invoices. And then we have our standard financial reports and our meeting minutes from our last special meeting in December 3rd.
All right, just to clarify, so do we need to approve that right now? Do we need to pull this out of this consent agenda and review those to approve them?
I believe you can just approve the consent agenda, and in that approval, approve those invoices. That's how we've done it in the past. Or maybe in the motion, approval of the consent agenda, including the 2 executive director invoices.
Okay. Any comments? No?
Pretty straightforward.
All right, move to public comment for item 6.
If you have public comment and you're in the boardroom, please come up to the podium. And if you're online, please raise your hand. There is no public comment in the boardroom or online.
Okay, we'll bring it back to the board.
In that case, I'll move to approve the consent agenda with the 2 executive director invoices included.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion passes 4-0.
Okay, thank you. All right, we'll move to item 7, public comments for items not appearing on the agenda.
If you have a public comment and you're in the boardroom, please come up to the podium. And if you're online, please raise your hand. We will take public comment in the boardroom first.
Hi, I'm Lynette Brooks. I previously commented on some things that should be included in the transient model, but since I only get 3 minutes at a time, you're going to keep hearing this every month. Today, I would like to concentrate on the specific use of model parameter estimation software with models so that thorough analysis and documentation are possible. All variables, such as recharge, hydraulic conductivity, streambed conductance, pumpage, etc., are considered parameters. It is critical that all variables be assigned as parameters in the software so model uncertainty accounts for uncertainty in each variable. All data used to calibrate a model, such as water levels, chloride concentrations, groundwater discharge to streams, are observations. Things the modeler wants the model to determine that are not observations, such as inflow and outflow to the ocean and Morro Bay estuary, future water levels, future chloride concentrations, location of the saltwater intrusion front, etc., are called predictions. Parameter estimation software allows for analysis and documentation of model parameters, observations, and predictions. Setting up the model this way allows for documentation of numerous important statistics, of which I will highlight a few. Parameter correlation. This occurs when parameters cannot be independently estimated and often involves recharge and hydraulic conductivity. In a simple linear system with no discharge observations, recharge and hydraulic conductivity are almost perfectly correlated. They could both be doubled or halved, and you'd get the same match to water levels. Another statistic, composite scaled sensitivities. These indicate the total amount of information provided by the observations for the estimation of each parameter. If you're splitting up the model into too many little zones or something, you're going to have some parameters that have no sensitivity, that doesn't change the observations. Prediction scaled sensitivities. Prediction scaled sensitivities indicate the importance of the parameters to the predictions. Prediction uncertainty. The information provided by the statistics about calibration allows the calculation of confidence intervals for predictions. The need to report uncertainty was highlighted in the Stetson Engineers Review of the steady state model in 2010. But it has not been done yet as far as putting some uncertainty on that sustainable yield number that comes out of the model. I have included a few references about these statistics in the electronic copy of the comments that I previously sent in. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
There is no further public comment in the boardroom, so we will take public comment online. Patrick, all you have to do is unmute yourself.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Hello?
we can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. Patrick McGivney, Chair of the Los Osos Sustainability Group, representing its thousands of members and supporters. It's been 10 years since you've been managing our basin. We've spent millions of dollars in doing so, but we still haven't met or achieved the basin plan's primary objective, and that is to stop or reverse seawater intrusion. In the first 7 years, you purposefully allowed seawater intrusion to progress, violating the basin plan and the stipulated judgment. You even approved a higher sustainable yield without having the appropriate infrastructure in place, that being programs A and C, which it was required by the stipulated judgment to happen before increasing the sustainable yield. You have also approved new building to take place, supporting the hyperbole that our basin is now sustainable. While all the while, we are in another drought year, followed by what is expected to be more years of drought. Our basin plan says that build out will require a supplemental water supply. We don't have one. State water is not a supplemental water supply. It's an outside water source, which the basin plan argues against. It's also unreliable. If I have misstated anything, please correct me. My point is, maybe it's time we reevaluate the committee leadership roles. That's not to say that Marshall and Mark haven't done the best they could. It's just that we haven't yet secured our water basin. Chloride levels are still increasing and are now at the highest levels they've ever been. Our water level has dropped again. Seawater intrusion is still progressing and our basin is not yet sustainable. My suggestion is this: Chuck Sesena becomes the new chair, Beth Reineke becomes the vice chair, Mark Zimmer becomes the treasurer, and Mr. Gibson becomes the secretary. And I hope you consider these options. I'd also like to state that the gentleman that spoke about our fire contingency, I would really like an answer to that also. Just that we'll think about it isn't a correct answer. Do we have a fire contingency? Do we have water that would support that? What are we going to do if we have a fire like LA Basin is having? We still have people setting off fireworks right now in a complete drought year. Thank you very much.
All right, we have no further public comment online or in the boardroom, but we do have a written public comment that I can read here. Andrea Peck submitted this. It says, I cannot make the basin management meeting, but I would like to serve as a messenger for my neighbors and me regarding the chronic flooding / stormwater runoff that occurs across our properties. I've included part of an email sent to me last week from John Waddell, highlighted below. Despite decades of efforts to get these drainage issues resolved, we are still told the same thing: there is no funding for this. As the fires decimate Los Angeles, the irony that we have had excess of water to the point of yearly flooding on our properties makes me feel that the sense of frustration has been boiling over the surface for many for some time. The truth is, that I am the messenger for at least 9 of my neighbors because of the overwhelming majority of them have given up on our supervisors, our county employees, and our LOCSC. John Waddell himself sent me, quote, several past emails, many of which he does not add were never answered by John Dodati and has never responded to an email. The responses I do get tend to either point fingers at another entity, SLO County versus LOCSD, or capsulate a lack of funding. What is not attached are the other phone calls, emails, letters, and meetings that my neighbors, before they gave up, sent or attended over the last 22 years, leading to the obvious question, why is there no funding after such a long time? There must be someone who will insist on obtaining funding. Final note, John Waddell mentions hiring an engineer. My home was completely engineered in 1992 by Alderman engineers and is built to handle 16 cubic feet per second of stormwater. Despite this, it has flooded twice in 2023 alone. All my neighbors, as you can imagine, have various engineering or construction built for large overflows of water, but the issue remains. We are not responsible for the runoff that comes from blocks and blocks of streets. That water needs to be managed and put to better use. And a quote from John Waddell, I am attaching several past emails from the county and Los Osos CSD regarding the drainage situation in the 10th Street area. The community does not have an extensive drainage system, so many areas have surface flow that crosses over streets and private property. The Los Osos CSD has the drainage authority in Los Osos. However, they have said there is not a funding source to construct projects that will solve the problems like the one you experience. Without funding for a larger project, the pre-existing drainage pattern may continue to impact your property, and you may need to work with private engineers and or contractors to determine if there are any improvements that can be made within your property. And with that, we have no further public comment.
All right. Thank you, Jamie. Good job. All right, we'll bring it back to the board. Dan, I don't know if you want to make any comments on any of the comments that were made.
I think, I guess just the question about the fire accounting, the stipulated judgment does not have an accounting for fire, and hopefully we never experience a fire event such as they're experiencing in Los Angeles. That would have obviously a huge impact on everybody, the community, their infrastructure, and water. But yeah, we don't currently have any sort of accounting set up for that.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Okay. We'll go ahead and close public comment. We'll move to item 8, the executive director's report.
Thank you, Chair Zimmer. Item 8, Executive Director's Report. Sorry, just let me get situated here. Still trying to make sure I'm in the right packet. Thank you, Jamie, for getting me pointed the right direction. Yeah, first item is the water recycling funding grant. The updates on that are highlighted in the Executive Director's Report. Due to delays in incorporating the AEM, aerial electromagnetic geophysics data, into the transient model, we had to request a modification to the schedule for the whole study, because the transient model is a critical path component of that study, to the state board for their consideration. We recently learned that the state board is in the process of agreeing to the schedule modification, and the updated schedule is shown at the table below this executive director's item. With that schedule update, the next steps for the transient model are for Cleith Harris to complete the inclusion of findings from the AEM data into the transient model, and then complete the calibration and meet with the peer review hydrogeologist and the technical advisory committee in February of 2025. And then subsequent to that, the Cleith Harris would then provide a presentation to the BMC. And so if you look at the schedule for the completion of the transient model that is being approved by the state board, it would have the draft report submitted in August, and then the final work completion date in November of 2025. Other items of note in the executive director's report are the basin monitoring program improvements. As the BMC is aware, we've awarded a contract for the modifications of LA 14 and LA 16. During the pre-construction meeting, it was identified that there could be an opportunity to improve that monitoring well by issuing a change order to the contractor to attempt to remove the sediment that is currently that has sanded in or has filled the bottom of the well. That's the reason that well, which was a production well, went out of service, is it was continuing to take in sand. The hope is that if we can remove that sand, that will allow us to install the new casing at a deeper location than was originally proposed in the design and bid documents. And by installing that casing at a lower location, it'll allow us to better track seawater intrusion at that location. And so we vetted this concept through the BMC party staff, got their approval, and it requested that the CSD, the lead agency on this project, execute the change order, which they have. Even with the change order, we're still well within budget for that project. And so that change has been made, and the construction for those well modification activities is scheduled to be completed the week of January 27th. And then on the land use and planning updates, I think on December 10th, this would be a new update. The Board of Supervisors adopted a resolution establishing a maximum annual allocation for calendar year 2025 of 25 units for Los Osos as part of the growth management ordinance, I believe. Sorry. And then we have the final accounting for recycled water, wastewater and recycled water flows from the water recycling facility in your packet. And that concludes my executive director's report.
Thanks, Dan. Quick question on the modeling. So you talked about some February 2025, and then you said following the meetings, BMC staff and Cleith will provide a present. Are you planning to provide that in February, or is it more when, I mean, are you gonna, because then you got like draft and such in August and September. Are you thinking it's gonna be more in those dates when, because I don't want to look at a draft report as much as I want to see the real report, right? So I'm thinking it's going to be more later in the year. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Yeah, I think we probably will break it up into a couple of presentations.
Okay.
So the water recycling funding study has two primary elements. One, we included a development of a transient model because we thought that was a management tool that we needed to better understand conditions in the basin and better plan potential future projects to improve sustainability. But the other key component of that is taking that model and then analyzing potential future projects and their benefits to the basin and sustainable yield. And so we envision in February having Cleith Harris present to the technical advisory committee, and which includes the peer review consultant, and then likely in a subsequent BMC meeting providing a presentation on the model specifically, sometime in April or March or April, more likely. And then once that's been done, then the engineering team that's as part of the overall project will take findings from the model and look at different sort of projects and implementation actions that the BMC could consider, and put together cost estimates and other things. And then all of that would be compiled in the draft report, which we would likely bring to the BMC sometime in late summer or fall for their review.
Yeah, okay.
So, yeah,
great.
so we'll probably break it up just given the significance of the modeling component of this project. So I would anticipate, multiple presentations between now and November on the project as a whole and the kind of primary components.
Yeah, all right, thank you for that clarification. Any other questions before we go to public comment? No? Okay, move to public comment.
If you have public comment and you're in the boardroom, please come up to the podium. And if you're online, please raise your hand. Looks like we have no public comment in the boardroom, but we do have public comment online. Julie, all you have to do is unmute yourself.
Thank you. This is Jeff Edwards. Good afternoon. And I'm speaking on the executive director's report, and I'm looking at the LOWRF wastewater and recycled water flows. This is in every ED report, and I'd like to raise objections to how we're deploying the water, particularly, and it's not a lot of water, but every drop counts. We're disposing of water at the Bay Ridge at 2 locations, I believe, in Bay Ridge, neither of which are functioning well in terms of supporting the oak trees that live there now. They're saturating the oak tree roots. They're dying. So I think the whole Bay Ridge discharge needs to be looked at. Also, by the way, the purple pipeline, the transmission line that runs water to the Bay Ridge disposal sites, has now failed 3 times at considerable expense. So that whole Bay Ridge deployment has been problematic. Likewise, we have a form over substance delivery of water to, quote, ag users at the end of Blue Heron Lane. They're watering a lawn with this valuable, highly expensive treated wastewater. I think that's a joke. And then lastly, in terms of recycled water uses, the schools, I know we're using federal monies to hook these schools up, Loams and Monarch, et cetera, but it's so little water and the infrastructure is costly. I think over time it's going to prove problematic from a maintenance standpoint. Bad idea on the schools. We need to focus on Broderson as much as anything. I'd like to hear a report what the status is of Broderson and how long we have to wait until we can really get some indication of its effectiveness. So, we talk about recycled water facilities planning, and I'd like to hear about the projects for which the executive director was referring that's going to come out of this study later this year. I really want to hear about the projects because I can't think of any except the ones I've recommended in terms of the dam and the well abandonment program. So I think we really need to focus, especially on how we're using our recycled water. We can do better. Thank you.
All right, we have one more public comment from Patrick. All you have to do is unmute yourself.
Thank you. This question is to Dan here. Is it my understanding from what you said that the transient model is not going to be presented until maybe sometime in the fall? Is it that late that we're doing it? And then also, I would like to bring to the attention of the committee here, under the Sustainable Yield Management Act, where it says that the Los Osos water basin is in critical overdraft. This has been stated in every ED report, and it doesn't seem like anybody's taking that seriously. We are in overdraft, regardless of what the county wants to tell us. Thank you very much.
There is no further public comment online or in the boardroom.
Okay, thank you. We'll bring it back to the boardroom. Dan, if you want to provide any comments back on our public comment.
There was a clarify, yeah, I think we covered it, but the transient model, which should be coming to the BMC, in spring, not fall. That would be the final draft and final water recycling funding program studies.
Yeah.
And I guess I would also, one of the things we envision utilizing the water recycling funding study and the transient model is to analyze what are the best and highest and best uses of the recycled water resource that we have, as well as other strategies to improve the safe yield of the basin.
Yeah.
I have one follow-up question to that, Dan. So do you think we'll have the transient model available when we're reviewing the sustainable yield for this next year?
Yes, we should. Yeah, I mean, typically we review the sustainable yield estimate in the fall. So we should have that tool set available to us when we do that.
Mhm.
Can I ask another clarifying question on that? Or not?
Sure, I'll allow it.
Just that the confusion on when the BMC gets the model, when the report is done, when will the model, which should be publicly available, become publicly available? The model itself, the files.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Right now it's in a draft form, and so it would be premature to release it. At some point, it will no longer be draft, and then presumably that's when it would become publicly available.
And that was kind of in line with my question, because if we're going to show it in the public, I didn't want it to be in a raw draft form kind of situation. I wanted it to be close to that point. So, but I don't think the date has been determined or anything like that, or the process for making it public either. All right. Okay, so we're going to close the executive director's report. Thank you, Dan. I appreciate it. We have a few action items today. Action item 9A, appointment of the BMC officers for 2025.
Yeah, so this is something we do on an annual basis, and I think it's one of my favorite items, is because I don't have to determine who the officers are. You guys get to figure that out. So, but yeah, if you have any questions about the process or the history, I'm happy to answer.
Okay. I guess, should we go to public comment first, or do we have any questions? You want to go to public comment first, or do you want to make any recommendations, or?
We should take public comment first.
Okay. Let's go ahead and take public comment first, and then we'll bring it back to the board.
If you have a public comment and you are in the boardroom, please come up to the podium. And if you're online, please raise your hand. Looks like we do not have any public comment in the boardroom or online.
Okay.
How are you feeling about continuing in this role? I mean, has it been something you've been enjoying?
Yeah, I think so. I definitely enjoy the fact of being extremely in tune to everything, every comment, every action of more than I was than when I was just a director. So it's really helpful in that way. Definitely over the time I've gotten more comfortable in it. But I'm not hard fast on holding the position either, you know, if there's other interest in that direction. I guess,
The burnout's not a factor yet.
not yet, no.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure
Yeah,
about
yeah.
that.
I mean, if you guys are comfortable with it, I'm comfortable with it too, you know.
I'm comfortable with it. I like the status quo. Change is hard.
Yeah. Okay, any other comments or recommendations? I think.
I'm fine with things continuing as they are.
Okay,
So moved.
all right, that's our motion.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes 4-0.
Okay. All right, well, thank you. I hope I'm doing a good job for the public and for the fellow directors, and I'll embrace the next year and do the best I can, okay? Thank you. All right, so we'll go on with action item 9B, approval of consulting services, and the proposals are included in this meeting today that weren't last time. And so for current year 2025, I think we have 3 of them in front of us. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. So if the BMC would recall at our last meeting, we reviewed and approved the calendar year 2025 budget. But the proposals for consultant services weren't properly noticed. And so we wanted to bring those back to the BMC for their approval consideration. There were just a couple of changes to the proposed budget that are outlined in the staff report, one to the executive director services, tracking those at a task level, not just a total budget level. And then there was another change to the BMC legal counsel budget where the at least the approved budget at the time reduced the budget for legal from 20,000 to 5,000 until there had been sufficient time for staff and the other parties to make a determination around potential conflicts in legal representation by the BMC and the CSD. In conversations with party staff, are still ongoing with regarding legal, and we anticipate bringing something with respect to legal back at our next meeting. So we don't really have an update there, but we do have the 4 proposals for the BMC's consideration. We have the executive director proposal, the BMC accounting services proposal, and then 2 proposals from Cleith Harris Geologists, one for the annual groundwater monitoring and the other for, the 2025 annual groundwater monitoring, and then for preparation of the 2024 annual report.
Okay, thank you. Bring it back to the board. Any questions before we go to public comment? No. Okay, we'll go to public comment.
If you have a public comment and you're in the boardroom, please come up to the podium. And if you are online, please raise your hand. We will take public comment in the boardroom first.
Hi, Lynette Brooks again. The proposed contract for Cleith Harris Geologists should include that all water quality data and all water level data be released to the public by a certain time after collection. For example, within 1 month of the last collection date or complete analysis of the chemistry. For both the spring and the fall measurements, this allows time to check the data and collections while still providing timely information to the citizens of Los Osos who are funding the data collection and relying on the results to ensure the aquifer is being managed sustainably. Tables for all water quality and water level data should be prepared that show all historic results at each location for all data. This would be similar to the table currently prepared for water quality in the lower aquifer. As it is now, water quality data in the upper aquifer and water levels are not available until the annual report is released, and the annual reports only contain data for the current year. For the public to analyze yearly differences requires each person who is interested to find the data in each annual report. The proposed contracts for Cleith Harris geologists should not include the condition that documents, including tracings, maps, and other original documents as instruments of service are and shall remain the properties of the consultant, except where by law or precedent these become public property. It is standard consulting practice that all work and documents paid for by a client become the client's property. The client in this case is the Basin Management Committee, but because all people in Los Osos are paying the water bills, they're funding this project, and maybe some other state money, the clients are really the citizens of Los Osos. In the case of county or state money, the list of clients grows to include more citizens. In other words, all the data, documents, etc., should be considered public property. The contract for the annual monitoring report should not specify that the report shall follow the 2023 annual monitoring report format as a template with updates for changed conditions. Some of the figures, tables, and text need modification to provide more data, be more internally consistent, and to highlight that saltwater water intrusion is occurring despite pumping being much less than the sustainable yield as estimated by the model. An example of this is the fact that in the Coastal Commission staff report, all they talked about was that number 69. 69, it's great. They never told the Coastal Commission about the saltwater was still intruding. It needs to be highlighted in that annual report. That's about it. Thank you.
We have no further public comment in the boardroom or online.
Okay, thank you. Any comments, Dan?
The contract or the proposal that we get from Cleith Harris is, I think, is something similar that we have received over even preceding my time in the BMC. As a sort of somewhat unique entity, the BMC doesn't necessarily, at least historically, have followed all the standard policies and procedures that may be required of a more formally defined governmental organization. That being said, you know, the work being performed on behalf of the BMC should be property of the BMC. We have, as BMC, developed a consultant contract that has been utilized with our legal counsel. And so that, and there are other contracting mechanisms if that's the desire of the board.
Mr. Chairman, if I might just offer my opinion on that. I don't think there's any paucity of access to the monitoring data, and we can certainly, you know, perhaps have Dan talk with Cleith Harris about at what point do they finalize the information that's going to be used in the annual report. At a point that they do that and transmit it to us, it becomes a public document. I don't know what the standard is. I think, you know, we've been working under this kind of contract for a long time, so one could argue that that is the standard of practice in this particular instance. But again, I don't see that there's no effort to hide this information. If it's desired on a quicker time schedule, we can talk with Spencer about when he thinks it could be finalized, the earliest point that it could be finalized in each cycle. It is reported to the BMC when it's ready. So I personally, I don't think there's any need to change the details of these proposals that have been negotiated.
Okay, thank you, Supervisor Gibson.
Yeah, sorry, or go ahead. Well, I would just add, yeah, we have in the past endeavored to make all data and information available to the public, and there has been no intent to withhold that data. there are certain just logistical challenges with certain data sets. Cleith Harris does not collect all of the data that gets utilized in the annual reports. And so there's a little bit that's out of their control. But I think to Director Gibson's point, we could talk with them and, you know, better understand what are the source of the data and the timing of when that data becomes available and how we can best make it available. I think it'd also be helpful to just understand what specific pieces of data and or in which format would be more useful for the people that want to see it, and you know, because there's no point in making it available if it's not helpful. So, but I do agree. I think there's work that we could do to just make this data maybe more readily available if we better understood the sources and timing of it.
Yeah, that is sort of what my follow-up question was too. Can I ask Lynette what exactly she's looking for that she's not finding? Is that an okay question to follow up with?
Sure.
Well, I haven't seen the water level data for last year. And you released the water quality data, well, for the lower aquifer, haven't seen the upper aquifer water quality data either.
Yeah, so that it'd be good to obviously talk to Cleith Harris on that, but my understanding is I think Cleith Harris collects the water quality data, but the county groundwater sustainability department collects the water level data. And some of that may overlap, obviously, but yeah, so and that's just where we need more information, find out when that water level data is available and when it could be made publicly available.
But if waiting until the annual report, that's a year after some of it's been collected. So.
Yeah, so I mean, that's something we could look into. Yeah, and I think yeah, you're right. The spring data obviously is collected in April or well in the spring, and so could be made available more early, more readily.
But isn't the annual report, I mean, that's when the report comes together, and that is the time that I believe the information should be released at that point, once it becomes a document. I mean, otherwise we're doing additional work. You're adding to, you know, to package that and get it out there in a public forum. So I don't know if he puts it together at that point, or I don't know. So it's just not what we've done. But one of the things was just that historical data that was mentioned, having that in the annual report. I know those are always helpful to look, you know, when you're reading that exact report and not have to go back year after year and look at information. You know, maybe that's something, Dan, you can work with, you know, in the annual report with Spencer, and just see if that's.
Yeah, and I may have misspoke there a little bit. I mean, we
Yeah.
do make the spring water level metric and chloride metric data available at the mid-year. Yeah, so yeah, check. It was in August of 2024 was when the spring data, and that I don't think it takes that long to come together. We just didn't have a meeting in July, so there was an extended period of time.
Thank you.
You know, just generally speaking, I have, we're done with public comment, right? We didn't have any more, Jamie? Yeah, okay, thank you. Just kind of generally speaking about the contracts, I made a few comments at our last meeting, and, you know, I really focus in on just the cost of our administrative cost is significant portion of our budget, if close to 2/3 of it. And so that's really looking at, you know, we just approved a over budget, you know, this year. So really that was the focus of a lot of my comments, and really would like to see some of this billing that happens be more task specific, and that, you know, these funds are used efficiently. What I recall was that we were going to become more efficient, you know, with some of the changes that we made last year, and we've increased our cost of administrative costs. So really going to stay on that, just to be open and frank about it, and really would like to recommend that you work with staff on that, how those bills are generated and produced, the invoices that come from, and what those costs are. And I know that there's some unknowns out there when we go for grant funding and things like that. Those to me seem like they should be very task specific and not lumped in with the normal executive director duties and costs and expenses. So just my comment. All right, so we have a action item. We're on 9B. This is for the consulting services. Any other comments on that before we make a motion? Okay, looking for a motion.
I'll move staff's recommendation.
I'll second.
Yep, thank you.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, motion passes 4-0.
All right. Okay, we're moving on, 9C. Consider approval of the BMC budget reserve target policy.
Yeah, so 9C, kind of well, I think it's exciting. I don't know if everybody else does, but in 2024, we made a pretty thank you, Jamie, change in how we managed finances at the BMC. Historically, we had a very sort of convoluted process of receiving invoices and sending them to an intermediate party who then invoiced each of the 4 BMC parties, who then paid, who then the intermediary that then paid the consultants. And you know, thanks to good input from our groundwater, our county rep, Blaine Reilly, we came up with a new system that's much more efficient, at least from a time perspective, in terms of how quickly we can get things paid in that. So now the BMC has a bank account. It invoices the BMC parties at the beginning of the year for their proportional share of the approved budget for that year. That money goes into a bank account, and then as the year goes along, we pay approved invoices from that funding. But one of the biggest benefits is at the end of the year, if there are unspent funds in that bank account, we have the potential to roll those over to the next year as a reserve or as a savings to try to fund a larger project in the future. But what we didn't have was any sort of policy guidance on how much money we might want to consider rolling over year. And so we've coordinated with BMC party staff to get their input. They've recommended that we set a target or a budget reserve target of 10% of our annual operating budget, which is roughly $35,000, that we try to target, you know, maintaining in the BMC bank account at the end of the year for carrying over into the next year. And so we wanted to propose that to the BMC and get either their approval or alternate direction on how to handle these, you know, rollover funds. And then, you know, a little bit about the mechanisms, you know, at the end of the year, we would quote unquote, you know, close out the budget for the year and assess how much unused funds we have. If we, you know, were below the target, then we would recommend rolling it over and potentially even requesting additional funds, but I don't know that we would get to that point. But if we were above the target significantly, then we could consider either refunding or probably more likely reducing the agency contribution invoices accordingly. And then those rollover funds would be, you know, they're not associated with any specific budget item for that calendar year, so they wouldn't be utilized without express approval by the BMC. So they're still, the BMC withholds all authority for the use of those funds. And then just as a practical matter, we talked about at the beginning of the meeting, we are projecting rolling over somewhere around $41,000 this year, assuming that the LA 1416 modifications comes in on budget, which we anticipate it will. We've already, you know, even with the change order that was authorized. So that, you know, that would be 41,000 rolling over. I guess in my mind, that's relatively close to 35,000. And, you know, I don't know that it warrants a reduction or a credit, but I open to input on that from the BMC. So yeah, that concludes my presentation.
So just to clarify, you're recommending that we roll over 41,000 for this year? Is that what you just?
You
meant
know,
by that?
it's a little premature to have the specific number. I just quoted that number just for context. But I mean, the reality is there's no specific action that needs to be taken. The money's
Yeah.
in the bank account. It's just whether or not we wanted to give some of it back to the parties is really, I guess, the action you would take.
Yeah, because I think we mentioned 46,000 when we were talking about the finance update. So, you know, just curious of what that actual number, and like you said, we don't have to probably figure it out right now, and maybe next time we come back, we have that tallied up, and all the invoices should be paid by then and approved, and so we should know the exact number.
Yeah, that's correct. I believe I did say 46 earlier. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, but better to do it once we've got all the
Yeah, I agree.
expenses before. Yeah.
And Mr. Chairman, I understand Dan simply wants to see if the BMC would endorse the concept of a 10% reserve target. That sounds perfectly reasonable to me. And on a case by case, as calendar year budgets close out, we can decide what, you know, certainly we need to be, it will be reported to us what is left over. Hopefully there's some every year, and we can decide to do as we wish, plus or minus that reserve target. So I'm supportive of the concept here.
Okay. All right, any other questions before we go to public comment?
I do have a question. So what are we envisioning as far as use for the money? Or do you have yet in mind maybe a limit on how much we might end up with? Or are there certain projects you have in mind that we could use it for? Or is it strictly contingency?
I mean, I think at this point, the thought is contingency. I mean, we approved a budget for calendar year 2025 that we believe is sufficient to complete the tasks that are included in that budget. This would be really envisioned as contingency. I could see in specific years, we could say we want to leverage this rollover plus the budget for that upcoming year to accomplish this specific project. But in general, it would just be general contingency. And really wouldn't target, it's not a cumulative thing. We're not targeting 35,000 every year. It's just maintaining that 35,000 on a continual basis.
If it's available. I
Correct.
mean, it's in the budget, in the county budgeting process, we call that fund balance available at the end of the year. And it's just considered another source of revenue for doing whatever it is we decide to do in the upcoming budget year.
Yeah. Okay. All right, let's go to public comment.
If you public comment and you're in the boardroom, please come up to the podium. And if you're online, please raise your hand. We have no public comment in the boardroom or online.
Okay. So we'll bring it back to the board. Yeah, no comment, generally supportive of having this reserve. And
Yeah.
I think the comment about the annual review is important to include there. That we'll look at this on an annual basis and year to year need. So some years it may come back, some years we may utilize the funds that we put in there. So I think it just depends.
I mean, if you want a motion, Mr. Chairman, I would move that the BMC endorse the concept of a 10% budget reserve target and direct staff to bring us a report showing what funds are, if any, are left over in a budget year, and seek direction from the BMC as to how that funding should be allocated.
And just as a point, well, not really a point of order, but a way to maybe help better formalize this, I might add to the recommendation that we incorporate, if approved, this reserve target into the rules and regulations document where we describe the bank account. So we have one place where we describe all this stuff. Don't have to go back to an agenda packet to remember, that what was approved.
So add that to the motion.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, motion passes 4-0.
Okay. All right, we're gonna move on to our last action item, 9D, draft fall 2024 Los Osos Basin Lower Aquifer Water Quality Monitoring Results and Chloride Metric update.
Yeah, so included in your agenda packet as something else we do on an annual basis is present the fall lower aquifer water quality monitoring results and an updated chloride metric. And it's just an updated chloride metric because we only track the water level metric during the spring. So as we discussed earlier, we presented that in August. Unfortunately, what we saw in the 2024 fall metric was an increase in the chloride metric, a pretty significant increase, at least relative to changes that we've seen over the last, let's say, 10 years. This increase is the highest calculated value that we have for the chloride metric, and is largely attributed to some pumping modifications that occurred in 2024, specifically related to the Rosina well, or LA10, which is one of the chloride, one of the wells included in our chloride metric, and actually it's a well that is double weighted, so its influence over the metric is twice that of any of the other wells that are included in the metric. And it's my understanding that in 2024, this well was pumped quite a bit more than it had been pumped in, say, the last 8 or 9 years, since potentially the last time that we saw a similarly elevated chloride concentration in the Rosina well, which was back in 2016, which, as I understand it, was also a time when the Rosina well had to be pumped more than it is pumped on a normal basis. And so that's the best understanding, at least that we have, for the explanation for why we saw such a significant jump in the chloride metric for fall of 2024. It's my understanding that, Rosina is back now to pumping normal levels, and so hopefully this influence is not occurring in the future. And then also, just important to point out that every time we talk about the chloride metric, is that it is due for an update. This is something the BMC has requested. It's something we've talked about on multiple occasions. The Rosina well is a production well, and thus influenced by production rates. And we've seen direct evidence of this. It also has borehole leakage, is influenced by upper aquifer leakage down into the lower aquifer. We've constructed a new well that could be considered a replacement for the Rosina well in the chloride metric, and actually we've constructed multiple new wells that could be beneficial to add to the chloride metric, as they're dedicated monitoring wells with separate completions in the zone D and zone E of the lower aquifer. And so that's the explanation that we have. The only other part I would add is that, the reason that we don't have the updated metric recommendations yet is that, we've asked Cleith Harris to deprioritize that relative to the transient model because of the importance of that initiative and the deadlines associated with the grant that's paying for that effort. So that concludes my introduction of the fall 2024 lower aquifer water quality data.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll just add to that. Thanks for the discussion on the well. It is a Golden State Water well that we pumped the Rosina well. And, you know, as Dan laid out, I mean, we've talked about Rosina well a lot, and it's Golden State's desire to not utilize that well at all, but it is part of our water supply mix that sometimes we do have to operate that well. And so we ran into that case this past fall and ran it more than we opted to. And so there are some unusual characteristics about the well. You know, it fluctuates in a way. It just supports, like Dan said, you know, these other monitoring wells that we're developing. One of the reasons I think we all really agreed is, you know, the need for those monitoring wells. You know, the seawater intrusion front that we see in Rosina, it's just always been a discussion every year whether we're getting a true representation, and then we're double weighting it. And so, yeah, we see a higher result at the end. But, you know, there's still a little bit unknown about how the quality of that information coming from Rosina well. So hopefully moving forward, we can not operate that well the way that we did in the fall. We don't see that same number coming in on our chloride levels that we see now. So,
But in the meantime, we've talked too much about this issue. And we don't seem to be able to get away from the double weighted well with the borehole leakage. We've got other monitoring wells that are supplying data in that area. How soon can we cut this loose from our monitoring program, our chloride metric? And do we need a parallel analysis that kind of tells us what things would be without using this as a double weighted factor? It just seems to cloud the picture so much.
yeah, that's a really good question. And I think,
Reports could be shorter. You won't have to explain the pumping pattern.
no,
of
right,
that.
right. You know, I think, gosh, when I think about completely getting rid of it, I don't know if I'd want to do that or just have it as a side note. So we have the history and we continue to see, does it match what we've always observed and how we positioned it? And then these new wells, I thought, you know, when we talked about that, these two new monitoring wells that we have are going to help. And then we brought the other one online previously. And so I think, I don't know, Dan, you can talk about it, but I thought it was just a matter of when do we make that decision and how do we document and.
Well, I know that you always run the risk of losing the history or changing the perspective of what you've looked at, but it just doesn't seem to be helping us.
Yeah, no, I agree. Maybe it's taken out of the metric itself, but it's still like a
piece of
footnote
information.
at the bottom of it that we want to recognize, like, hey, this is still out there. And then maybe we do that for a few years and we decide that's not needed at all.
Not changing.
Or the well gets abandoned itself. You know, I mean, the well's not long for even being a water supply production well either. So.
Yeah, no, all good points. One of the challenges is maintaining that historical record of some sense, you know, and there's strategies to do that, or maybe, like you said, you maintain it for a certain period of time and that's no longer valuable. And it, you know, I think one of the things that's helpful, and I'm not advocating that we keep the well, but to have this historical record for the water level and chloride metric kind of helps tell the story of what has occurred in the Los Osos Basin going back to the 1970s. It's, you know, it's obviously it's somewhat of a simplified explanation where it characterizes it all down to one number per year. And then again, at the same time, as somebody who has to, present and try to explain to people how this works. It is a helpful tool, I find, and not that we would give this up, but I think, you brought up some good questions about what about the other wells. And so this is going to be hard to read, but I can at least go through it verbally. So, yeah, you can't really see it, but LA 11, it's in the staff report, but we've seen relatively consistent levels of chlorides in the other wells. LA 11, the Pasadena well, has actually showed a decrease, which is a positive thing. We've had historically seen an increasing trend. The new one, well, I call it the new. It's really not that new anymore, but the lupine monitoring well that went in 2019, or we call it the Cuesta by the Sea well, showed a very consistent chloride concentration in Zone D and in Zone E. So that's one of the new wells that we talk about. We've talked about Rosina, Howard East, not a new well, but is not showing an increase. LA8 is in the range of historical values in the 70, 80s milligrams per liter. Golden State's Cabrillo well, not part of the metric, showing an increase, but not a historic high. If you look at the record, Los Osos CSD 8th Street well, showing a higher value than we've seen, but not a historic high. South Bay well in the range of historic estimates. Sorry, there's a lot of more wells here, but I think this is hopefully helpful context. Similarly for Golden State's Bay well number 1, LA 20 in the range. Same for LA 18, LA 32, a higher value, but still within maybe slightly over the historic range. LA 39 in the historic range. LCSD Palisades is not the highest extent. And then here's a lot of the new wells. So the Farrell well is what was modified in 2023. It's showing a chloride value of 37, which is lower than with the previous recordings. Now with the new wells, we don't have a long history of record. But it is data that's not influenced directly by pumping in and around areas where the Rosina well is, so there are other helpful data points for us to see. The Skyline well, which is probably the closest, showed a reduction from spring to fall in both the Zone E and Zone D. So we do have other data. It's just not part of our metric, but I think we're going to work to get it in there and keep these reports shorter in the future.
If I could just comment, we could do a number of things. We could go back and recalculate. And Dan, let me ask, the metric, as I recall, is simply the average of the observed concentrations with Rosina double weighted. Is that correct?
It's the average of the observed of, I believe it's 5 total wells with Rosina double weighted.
So, we could, if we had nothing better to do, we could go back and recalculate the metric with Rosina single weighted or Rosina not there and plot that out over time. And, I imagine because it's double weighted and variable, those exercises would take some of the noise out of the observations. That's one thing that I've, having spent 10 years looking at this, what I realize is we do have to look at it over time, that we're getting a better sense of the year-to-year variability. And there's fancy words to describe that versus our inability to actually know the physical system. But by and large, we're looking for trends here. But as I say, where we could go back and redo this and analyze it is probably not worth the effort, given the soon to be brought forward transient model, which I think will guide us in a better direction. Let me just add then one observation. Going back to 2016, the spike that we saw in 2016 was followed by years of decline where presumably the Rosina well wasn't pumped as heavily as it was in 2016. I think we can imagine that's going to be the case with the spike we see in the presentation today. And simply what that tells me is that our basin management plan is right. We need to stop pumping those wells that are closer to the coast and shift the production further east. And so, you know, in a weird way, I think what we're seeing there is validation of our understanding of how the basin works. But I think we just sort of stick a pin in this one, and we're going to be measuring again in the spring, not that far in the future, and let's see where we go from there.
Okay.
I do want to make one comment. So just looking at the data and over time as well, and all the highlights of I guess the times when Spencer deemed that this was upper aquifer influence due to the wellbore leakage. So I mean, I feel like one thing we can't miss here is that if this is the result we're getting now when you're pumping the well, that truly is a representative sample. That's essentially how you get a good sample out of a well, is to pump it longer. And so I just don't want us to get hung up on the fact that it's high and then disregard it for that reason. I think that's a mistake also. So I just want to have that comment here registered.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's still unknowns there. I mean, that's a good comment. But that chloride could not be coming inward. It could be moving laterally too. So we talk about fingers and things like that. I mean, there could be other factors that are happening there. There's just so many unknowns to it, but not to disregard your comment, but those are kind of the things we were thinking too when we're thinking about it, you know. Okay, if there's no other comments, we're going to go to public comment on this item.
If you have public comment and you're in the boardroom, please come up to the podium. And if you're online, please raise your hand. We will take public comment in the boardroom first.
Hello, Lynette Brooks again. First, I would like to comment on the presentation of the water quality data. The annual reports and tables in today's agenda, as we're looking at, state that, well, LA10 has problems with borehole leakage and that some chloride concentrations have been adjusted to account for that. The reports have never made it clear, however, how those values are adjusted. How do you guess what the other number would be? That needs to be better explained. The annual reports and the tables today also indicate that water in wells LA15 and LA31 are affected by the upper aquifer, but should also have more explanation. Are the lower chloride concentrations, when they are not pumping, really caused by upper aquifer influence, or because they are not pumping? They are not inducing saltwater intrusion. How much pumping was occurring in LA31 before the relatively low chloride concentration for October 16th, 2024? Second, I would like to comment on the chloride metric. The fact that pumping had increased at LA10 prior to the sampling event should not be used as an excuse to minimize the significance of the high chloride metric. That excuse could be used for all wells, because if no wells were pumping, we would not be worried about saltwater intrusion. The basin plan states, reductions in pumping from the lower aquifer should result in measurable declines in chloride concentrations at LA10. In fact, the ISJ group was so sure that chloride would be reduced at this well that they double weighted in the chloride metric. Despite years of the basin yield metric being below 80%, the chloride metric has not declined. Despite years of the basin yield metric being below 80%, chloride concentrations at well LA11 have dramatically increased. Despite years of the basin yield metric being below 80%, the 250 milligram per liter chloride boundary has not been pushed back to the middle of the Morro Bay estuary, as shown on Figure 38 in the basin plan. Given the dramatic increase in the chloride metric, and the court declared responsibility of the BMC to ensure sustainability, does the BMC plan to petition the county to postpone issuing building permits until additional water quality data, water level data are available, and the transient model is published? Thank you.
Robert Sarby. Could you put the chart up about the chloride metric, please? Now, what I see in that chloride metric is you're predicting that it's going to go down, but all it has done is gone up. And if the only well that the chloride metric went up was the one that you have the high reading on, I could accept your explanation, but I can't, because chloride metric has gone up in other wells as well. This committee's not its sole responsibility, its main responsibility is to prevent seawater intrusion. And we're failing. So I would suggest that no more building occur until we get this chloride metric under control. That's what we're here for. That's what this committee was formed for. And that needs to be done before we start building more homes. Thank you.
There's no further public comment in the boardroom, but we do have one online. Jeff Edwards, all you have to do is unmute yourself.
Thank you. Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Edwards. And in my view, this is not as much about the monitoring wells, but about our supply wells. And what this underscores is the need to adhere to our core basin management plan strategy of shifting pumping from the west to the east. And we are barely midway, if you will, into Program C. We need fundamentally the LOCSD to bring on their Bay Oaks Drive Program C number 2 well as soon as possible, which would allow them to reduce or eliminate pumping or extractions from Palisades. Likewise, the Golden State Water Company needs to pursue and complete the Program C number 3 well, which would allow them to get off Rosina. It couldn't be any simpler. So that's what we need to focus on, is firming up those 2 Program C wells, number 2 and number 3, as soon as possible. And I know the CSD is well underway. Golden State, that needs to get going. Simple as that. With those wells established, we will have shifted pumping to the east pursuant to the Basin Management Plan, further east. So that's it. Thank you very much.
We have no further public comment in the boardroom or online.
Okay, thank you. We'll bring it back to the board. Yeah, I mean, I generally agree, you know, shifting the pumping is our objective. It's what we need to do, and we need to keep moving in that direction for sure.
When will our well be online in service? It's February, March. February, March. Yeah, okay, a month or 2. Yeah.
Nice. All right. And we're likewise preparing and evaluating for a 3rd well too. So we're working on it. This takes time. All right.
There was, if we don't mind,
Okay,
there
sure.
was one question about how are the Rosina levels adjusted when the nitrate concentrations are too high. So it's the general approach, as I understand it, is that if when the samples are collected for the metric, if the nitrate levels are too high, Cleatheris will first look to Golden State operational data to see if there aren't other representative values that Golden State collects for their own operational purposes. And if there aren't values that could potentially be used in that case, then they have to reuse what they consider a representative value from the past. So it's a repeat of the previous year.
And those are noted. We usually add a footnote in the report when that happens.
Yep.
Thought we were talking about chloride, and then you changed it to nitrate, so.
So sorry, nitrate is used as an indicator constituent for whether or not the well is experiencing borehole leakage. So if the nitrate concentrations are above, I believe it's 2.1 milligrams per liter, then it is it has been determined that that's under the influence of borehole leakage, and that chloride value is not representative.
Okay. No other comments, board members. We have an action item. Do we have a motion to accept the report?
Just receive and file, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, that can just happen. We have received, and
Okay.
I'm sure Dan will file it, so.
All right, sounds good. Okay, we'll go ahead and close action item 9D. That concludes our agenda. Last item is adjourned. So meeting's adjourned. Thank you.
All right, thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.